This is Scott Allen Miller here on Sam IT on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about a little complex subject, and this is the factor of opportunity with going to university. Now this one comes up a lot and it's really hard to explain, and I have to talk about it often, and it's a little bit hard to really put the pieces together. Normally when we're talking about university, we're talking about which courses you should take. Is university right for you? How do we look at lifetime earnings of people who went to university versus who got a graduate degree or didn't go to university at all? And those are relatively simple topics. They're mostly just math that we can produce from the Department of Labor Statistics. But when we're looking at this particular subject, which is the cost of lost educational opportunity for people within those statistic ranges, it gets a little bit hard. So bear with me, here we go. When we're looking at normal Bureau of Labor Statistics, what we're dealing with is a complete number. All people who went to college, all people who didn't go to college, and that's pretty much it. This is very misleading for a number of reasons. First, let's talk about the people who went to school later. Okay, so let's say you're a normal student. You normally will go to college around age 18, and you'll finish around age 22. This is normal, and we have this in our minds. We kind of think about this. So we think about people who, when we look at the statistics of how much you will earn on average after having gone to college, as being based around this scenario. And for a lot of people that's true, but it is not the only scenario, and it is not the one that's significant to increased earnings. So what happens in another scenario, and this is not important for saying that college is not a factor, it's important for realizing how to apply these numbers to a decision factor when you're at a different age looking to go to college yourself. A great number of people will not go to college, will build a career, will have a job, and at some point when they're ready to make more money, or they're already making a fairly good income, their job will send them to college, possibly paid, possibly during work hours, possibly inclusive in their job. It may include a raise or promotion or whatever, but what's important to realize is these are people who are already late in their careers who are being given an opportunity to get college. And in many cases, it's simply free college. I know lots of people personally who have worked jobs, and at those jobs, getting a degree is simply a benefit of the job. They don't get a raise for it, they don't get a promotion, nothing. It's simply that they get a degree for free, and it's a benefit, right? It's a tax write-off for the employer. But these people, when they get a degree at 50 years old and get no raise, still have a very high income rate in most cases, much higher than the non-college per weekly average. But once they get that degree later in life, all of their higher earnings later in life are counted as college earnings, not as high school earnings, as non-college earnings. And this skews the numbers for how much the average per week made by someone who has a degree dramatically. It's very important to understand that the statistics show the amount that someone who has finished college earns, not the amount they earn because of college, right? We have to look at the causality here, and leaving that out makes the numbers very misleading to an insane degree. It's also important to remember that college is a ratchet effect, right? Some of the things that we know is that, with rare exception, all people will earn more throughout their careers. When you're 18, you'll earn roughly the least, and when you are close to retirement, you will earn roughly the most. There are exceptions, but you take any large number of people and the numbers will show a gradual climb throughout your career, or a dramatic climb in some cases. When we deal with university, we're dealing with a one-time life event. Once you've gone to university and acquired a degree, you switch from being in the one pool to being in the other pool, from the undegreed pool, non-degreed pool, to the degreed pool. And that always happens along this timeline. No exceptions. There's no way for it to not happen in this way. So we're not comparing two completely different pools of people. We're comparing two pools of people that can later in life migrate in one direction. But no one who's doing really well later in life can leave the graduated pool, the degreed pool. Their degrees are permanent. So all the people, no matter whether they get their degrees at 18 or 65, their numbers before their degree, when they're younger, go into the non-degreed pool, and their numbers later go into the degreed pool. So this is very misleading simply because we're always looking at different age averages. And that's huge. And no one ever breaks those out to say, what does the average 25-year-old make in these different scenarios? What does the average 30-year-old make in these different scenarios? And no one breaks out to say, did the degree ever get used? For example, I know people who have gotten degrees after getting their job and never go looking for a job again. But suddenly, very, very high-income people who just got a degree for fun now show up as if, and people use them as an example of how a degree gets you really good jobs, when they could tell you that they didn't have a degree when they got the job, and the job never found out they got the degree. So these numbers can be very misleading, and that's not even the big factor. The big factor is who is eligible for these pools. When we look at these numbers, so there's a couple things. One is that there's a group of degrees, degree areas, such as medical doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, lawyers in most states, pharmacists, civil engineers. These are generally high-paying jobs, almost always. And these jobs require a degree. They don't optionally let you have a degree versus not having a degree. They require them. And they require them because the government says so. So these are anomalies and don't count in any decision matrix, because if you want to go into one of these fields, you don't have a decision to make. You will simply get a degree and get these jobs. Period. That's how it works. It's not competitive. So if you're one of those people, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know you have to get a degree, and you shouldn't be watching this video because it makes no sense. Now, there's another pool of people that we often ignore, and those are the people that can't get a degree or can't reasonably get a degree. Not because they can't afford it, but because they can't, right? These are the people who simply cannot finish a degree. They may not be able to finish high school. They may not have done that. So, but we include both of these numbers in our pools when we're looking at whether university is beneficial to us. And that makes no sense, because this one group has to have a degree, they don't have an option. And this other group can't have a degree, they don't have an option. And these two represent, in one case, almost certainly the lowest paid group throughout their careers. And the other, while it may not be the highest paid, it is a very highly paid group. And so these are both huge skewing numbers, because the only people that this discussion matters for are people who can go to college but don't have to do the career that they want, which in our case is likely to be people like software engineers and IT professionals, but could refer to a lot of professions where these things are purely optional, and it's what we call performance-based careers, where the only thing that matters is can you do the job well, not are you certified, right? So IT and SE especially, these numbers throw off everything we know about college, because we know if you can work in IT, you could have gotten a degree and you don't need one. And so when we're looking at our decision matrix, we have to take these people out. That changes the numbers in ways you can't even imagine. Suddenly what's a barely better not having gone to college financial number becomes a dramatically better one, right? Because we're looking at the wrong pools. We're looking at a large pool of numbers that simply don't make sense to mash all together. But the reason that it's done is because the more you mash everything together and ignore these two factors I've talked about, the more it makes university look like a slam dunk, when in fact it's a pretty risky financial decision. Even if you're not paying for school, even if it's free, the cost of lost opportunity is pretty dramatic and very hard to overcome. Now, those things aside, let's talk about the really big factor that everyone ignores. And this is that we assume that when people go to university, they will enter the career field somewhere around age 23, and that will be their entry-level point. What we compare that against normally, at least in most discussions, is we compare against people who did nothing during that time. And that's what the big pool numbers tend to do. We're comparing people who got degrees versus people who simply didn't get degrees. But that's not what our comparison is actually about. If we want to know if university is valuable to us, anyone who's asking that question, anyone who's in a position of wanting to know, is university valuable for my career? What they're really asking is it a good opportunity versus alternatives? this is where all the things we've done so far ignore the alternatives, because we assume the alternative is to do nothing or maybe to go work in fast food. That's not the actual alternative to someone who's looking for career advancement, because they're not going to actually sit idle for 4 or 5 years while their university counterparts party, take some classes, and eventually are ready to enter the field so that they can all say, okay, now even playing field, let's enter together. It's not how it works. The person who's not going to go to university has the opportunity to enter the working force, not just before they would go to university, but possibly before they get out of high school, because they don't have to worry about getting ready for university. They don't have to worry about planning for university. They don't have to worry about having to quit that job to go to university. They get to jump right in, self-education. All that time that someone's in university and classes, their counterpart can be sitting at home, building a home lab, writing code, building out systems, and doing other complicated things to advance their education at a pace that universities cannot match. It's not university's fault. You can't do in a classroom at the same pace as what you're doing on your own. More importantly, the top things that you need to learn are often things you must teach yourself. Self-education is one of the most important factors in all of education. This is where your critical thinking comes from. And you can't learn that, again, sitting in a classroom. Not that classrooms are bad, but they're inefficient and they don't work for how normal people learn, and they're not good for how IT people need to learn or software engineers. They don't reflect the real world, and they don't reflect the things that you're going to need to do to keep learning later in life to keep your career going. So university actively promotes bad practices for those careers. Learning on your own, however, does the opposite. It teaches you what you need to do to be ready to do things after you would have gotten out of university, but it makes you do it younger, or gives you the opportunity to do it younger. So when we're really making comparisons, we need to think about someone who is 18 and honestly goes out to teach themselves what they need to know and looks for a job in their field. The same things that someone should be doing when they graduate from university at age 22 or 23. If we do this comparison, and this is very difficult to do, there's no checkbox for I really tried to get a job and I really tried to self-educate. But those are the actual alternatives to university when we're talking about someone who's career ambitious and trying to find out what's good for them. This takes our pool from millions and millions of people who are completely generic into a pool of several thousand people. And while we don't have statistics on it, anecdotal evidence suggests there's no exceptions. There must be some, but there's no known exceptions to someone who does this and doesn't excel in their field. Going out as a high schooler or a recent high school graduate, building a home lab, teaching yourself, honestly making an effort, probably trying to get certified, because that's very, very open to people without a degree, versus someone going for a degree. I have never heard, let alone met, someone who has done this and not been in a position to hire or fire that university grad years before that university grad enters the workforce, right? That's big. Now, of course, we don't have statistics for it, but common sense says it has to be true. It's everywhere that we look for it. The problem is that so few people do this. We have a very large number of people who go to university in any number of situations, and we have a number of people who are non-degreed, but the number of people who actively take a career ambitious alternative to university is so tiny that, one, people who think that there's no opportunities for them are crazy. We only need a few thousand good job openings to handle all of those really ambitious people. Now, of course, hundreds of thousands of people may switch to that mode, and then those jobs will be flooded, but then companies will be prepared to adjust as the workforce is flooded with people who are more ambitious in doing those things. It's a self-fixing problem, but it's not a problem that exists at all. That's a myth, right? It's a complete myth. It's a myth so much I don't even know where it might come from. I know of no one who's ever witnessed it. I know lots of people who went to university and got degrees and believe it to be true, but they're not the ones who would be able to observe it. So that's not a good reference point. Of people who've actually tried to do that work, they're all mystified. Universally, no matter where you look, they have no idea where this illusion of a barrier comes from. So this is what's very difficult to ascertain. In my own life, I got to do this in a different field. I got to work in hospitality. It was very interesting, and this is where I learned some of these things. While I did do some university work, I attended a university for a program in one thing, but while I was there, I was working in another field in hospitality. During that time, I got to know a lot of people who were going to school for hospitality, and this was really interesting. I was working just as a normal laborer in the field that they wanted to go to school for while I was going to school for something else. I would ask them, and I have asked directly, why do you not go get a job in your field at least while you're going to school, or why not just drop out of school and work in your field? What's the purpose of school? And they think, well, I want to get ahead. This is what you have to do. Yet, while going to school for something else and not having a degree and putting in 1 year in that field, I was promoted to manager and was in a position to hire those people years later, which I didn't. I left the field. But the point is that 1 year in hospitality, just working in it, you were more likely to be ahead of someone who got a 4-year degree and was ready to enter it. That person with a 4-year degree going into hospitality would still need a year of experience in the field to move from entry level to, say, manager. But a person without a degree at 18 could do the same thing. Statistically, it may be that the person who gets a degree will move faster, and that the person without a degree would more likely on average do it in, say, 18 months instead of 1 year. Given that makes sense and is probably appropriate. But the person going to university still would take 5 years to get to manager instead of 1.5 years, and all that time they'd have to pay for a degree or whatever. Later in life, if there was a barrier somewhere along that career for the person who didn't get a degree, they could get that degree later, probably on the company's dime, and their numbers would be skewed, as we talked about before, but they would still have that advantage of having gotten in and built their career early and having that income earlier. Those things are really dramatic, and that's hospitality. IT is so much more dramatic that our university training is not as beneficial, and our ability and need to teach ourselves is so much higher. In hospitality, you don't have to teach yourself the equivalent of a college degree every 5-6 years. But in IT, you do. You're constantly having to learn. And if you can't do that on your own, if you're not prepared for that, if you're not trained for that, it's going to be a really large barrier to your career later on. So there's no simple answer here. But it's very important to understand that the numbers we're looking at, first of all, don't paint the rosiest picture. We have to understand what they look like. But then we also have to look at causality, we have to look at skews in the numbers, and we have to look at how we're looking at big numbers of non-applicable people when we're actually talking about a small group of alternatives between one path of going to university and another path of doing something ambitious that is alternative, but not something crazy. We're not talking about people being entrepreneurs. We're not talking about people getting lucky. We're not talking about outliers or things that normal people can't do. We're talking about things that any given person who's ambitious and wants to excel in a competitive field can do anytime, which is get the equipment, teach themselves, home lab, get certified where you can, look for a job as early as possible. And it doesn't mean you're going to get hired right away, but that's another part of the myth. Yes, people coming out of university are more likely to find a job within the first 6 months. That's fine, but the person who didn't go to university has 4 years before they get to the start of that 6-month mark. So if you can find a job in anything less than 4.5 years, not going to university, you are hired probably before the person who went to university. And chances are it's not going to take you 4.5 years. In many cases, it's going to take you 9 months instead of 6 months. These are small numbers differences. They're not dramatic. And as we used to be taught in consulting, back when I was a full-time consultant in the early 2000s, when companies say 4 years of school or equivalent, the equivalent is 6 months experience. That was the industry guideline. 6 months is not hard to come by. Go out and volunteer. And that's another, we'll cover some of this in other videos, but there are so many simple ways that you can essentially guarantee, no luck needed, that you're going to get a jump on your career early on if you're ambitious and actually take the effort to teach yourself, build a lab, volunteer, look for a job. Those things mean you're going to have a good time in your career. It doesn't guarantee the most career success by the end of your career. You still need to maintain those things throughout your career. You still have to get a little bit lucky. Everyone does a little bit, but make your own luck. These things are open to you. Please remember to like and subscribe, and there's going to be lots of comments on this. Be sure to include them below.